Battery's very low on this camera, so I'm not sure how much of this I'll get. But I'm just thinking about Silenus, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, Silenus, who is a character in ancient Greek mythology and stories. Interesting character. He's sometimes, in his earliest versions at least, he was portrayed as a chimeric figure, half man, half beast. He usually had a horse's ears and a horse's tail, sometimes even a horse's legs. So he's kind of on his way to being a centaur, but not quite. And he was a drunk, and he hung out with Dionysus and the satyrs. Interesting character. And he's usually portrayed in sculpture as a kind of fat guy, always leery and always drooling. His eyes are all goggly. A classic kind of drunk, really. And one of the things that happens to him in his life is he makes the acquaintanceship of King Midas. I think in some versions he's captured by King Midas or held prisoner. In other versions I think they're kind of friends. But either way, he's a mate of King Midas. I think he's the one who's actually responsible for King Midas getting that famous wish, you know, where he turns everything to gold, which works out badly. Anyway, I might be wrong on that. But anyway, he hangs out with King Midas, and at one point King Midas asks him, you know, what is the secret of a good life? What's the best thing in life? And he prevaricates for a while, doesn't want to say anything about it, but King Midas insists. And eventually he says, well, the best thing is not to be born, and if you are born, the best thing is to die young, Silenus says. It's quite a famous passage, and it's picked up, I think Schopenhauer uses it as the basis of some of his writing, and I think it appears in Nietzsche, but again I might be wrong on that. Best not to be born, if you are born, die young. That's his kind of philosophy. Which seems a bit odd considering he seems such a party animal, you know, a fat guy, always getting drunk, bullying around the place, hanging out with the satyrs, hanging out with Dionysus. But what's important, I think, in that is that you have to remember that Silenus, anyway, him is not a mortal. He's not a human being. He's an immortal. He's not one of the gods exactly, I don't think, but he's immortal somehow anyway. And his immortality has consequences. Obviously, everybody he's attached to dies. He sees the fragility of the world around him, and he's deeply, deeply envious of the human beings who are able to work through the arc of their life and die, and desperately wants to be able to die himself, but he can't. It's forever held off from him. It's almost as if the sentence of his life can never have a full stop. You know, he can never make sense of it. You know, because sentences only make sense when you stop talking, don't they? So it's almost as if the sentence of his life can never have that punctuation point, and he knows it, and the concept of that is deeply ingrained within him, and he knows he can never do that. There's always going to be a tomorrow, and that's a deep problem for him, I think. I just remember when I was a kid, actually, I used to read a comic, I can't remember what it was now, but there was a character in there who was, I think it was set in the Old West, and this character couldn't die. I think he was a kind of a vampire or something, but he couldn't die, and he hated being alive, and he was looking out for, he always wanted to die, so he was looking out for any opportunity to get shot with something made of silver, because I think it was the silver bullet thing which would kill him. So each of the little plots each week would involve him, you know, nearly getting shot with something silver and then not doing. Anyway, after a few months and perhaps years of my reading this, they changed the plot line. He suddenly started to appreciate life, this character. I don't know, something happened where lots of people thanked him, and there was an illustrated panel where he becomes overwhelmed with the joy of life because everybody's so nice to him. And he says, "Oh, right, from this moment on, I'm going to celebrate my immortality." And of course, every plot line in the episodes after that was to do with him avoiding being shot by silver. So all of the difficulties that he had prior to that moment were kind of reversed. And he was constantly being threatened by silver bullets from there on. Anyway, that's kind of a side issue. But this idea that not having a punctuation mark which ends your life, I think is quite important, and I think that's one of the things that's in Silenus, and you do find it elsewhere, I think, as well. You find my favourite example of that is in Waiting for Godot, the play by Samuel Beckett, which is itself a kind of endless waiting. Two tramps slash clowns by the side of the road, just waiting for an end, trying to find ways out of there, and they never do. But there's a couple of characters who come in halfway through, Pozzo and Lucky. And Lucky is this half man, half horse character, and that he's pulling a cart. He's like a horse, and he's wearing a rein, so he's being used as a horse by Pozzo, and he's treated very badly. And at one point, Pozzo, who is Lucky's master, commands him to speak, and Lucky just starts this spiel. There's about 2 or 3 pages in the play of this just endless garbage, repeated, beautifully written of garbage, but garbage nevertheless, which the actor playing Lucky has to just say over. He just recites. It's never ending, and there's no punctuation in it, and it's kind of horrifying because it's so vertiginous. It just goes on and on and on. You think, when's this going to stop? I think there's something of that about it. Of starting a sentence, you're never going to finish, like a life sentence. You're never going to finish. I think you also find a little bit of that in Molly Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses. Molly Bloom is not a horrific character, and she's not presented in that way, but all of her speech is stream of consciousness, so there's none of the organised sentence structures that you get, so it's just an internal monologue, which again, because it's a monologue, I guess, can feel kind of horrifying. It can feel like I don't know if you ever get this, but if I haven't spoken to anybody for a while, I've got an internal monologue going on. It is like I'm just spinning my wheels, and I sometimes think, when is this ever going to stop? How am I going to quieten this mind down? So it's a bit like that. I did have another example, actually. I don't know. But yeah, for me there's something in there about Silenus and the horror coming into existence is also to do with a fear of immortality. It's not where you start, it's where you finish. And if you don't even have to finish on top, you just got to finish, You just got to finish. Anyway, I'm here in Cheshire, look. I've made quite a lot of videos here. In this particular field. I don't live here anymore, I'm just visiting. But that landscape's featured in quite a lot of my videos. It's quite weird being here again, because I can kind of feel the echoes of every other occupation that I've made of this particular piece of landscape. That'll do, I think. Thank you very much for your patience.